In this 22nd Sunday of Ordinary Time, Year B, we go back now to the Gospel of St. Mark. You'll remember that in the past several weeks, we have been reading from the Gospel of St. John chapter 6. And as I have referenced numerous times, the Gospel of John chapter 6 is about the Holy Eucharist, the bread of life discourse. Now, if you're interested in those reflections, you can find them all on my YouTube channel here. Now, on this Sunday, we turn to the Gospel of St. Mark, and we read in chapter 7, verses 1 to 8, then 14 to 15, and then 21 to 23. You see, these verses are very interesting, and there is a lot for us to unpack here. So then let's go ahead and get started. So one of the very important things we must always learn to do is to distinguish the difference between divine law and human law. Now, for many of those out there who are lawyers, right, who are specialists in the law or who are familiar with the law, you know, what we consider divine law is in fact evident in nature. For example, the laws which are found in the 10 Commandments are considered divine law. Some of these examples from the 10 Commandments include love God, love your neighbor, right? You shall not steal, you shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery, etc., etc. Now, all of these divine law, if you will, has its basis in the divine, in God himself, who ordered it in this way. You see, these laws are reflected in nature as well. And so then through natural law, that is the law observable in nature, it is then considered the mirror image, like, you know, when you look in the mirror and you see yourself. Natural law then is considered that mirror image of the divine law. Now, divine law aside, there's also another branch of law known as human laws. And the reason for human law is for the ordering of communities and societies. It is essentially about governing people. Now, as you can imagine, some very small communities, you know, they might not have a developed system of law. However, for many of us who are living in, you know, large, big, organized and regulated societies or large communities, you know, we see the law has a big role in bringing order to society. Because as you'll see, without the law, there can be chaos and problems and disruptions. And without the law, it's hard to discuss justice, right? Because you will have no law, you have no basis. When there's an argument, how do you resolve the issue? And so that's the interesting thing about this dynamic then between divine law and then human law. So then in general, we can say that human law tends towards the good of that society. But remember too that human laws must always be just. It must apply to all people. Otherwise, you have known what's in the past, as we've experienced numerous times before in various different societies. You know, you have this two-tier system, or maybe even three or even more, right? Where the law applies only to a select group of people. And of course, as you can see, that is not justified, right? There's no justice there. But more on all that at another time. Here though, my point is simply this. God revealed to us certain truths, those found in the 10 Commandments, for example, that is the law, which then over time needs to be developed further. And these laws need to be developed to further clarify, well, what about this issue? What about that issue? What about various different exceptions that may come up? Let me just give you one simple example. I think most of us can agree that the commandment, you shall not kill, is divine law, right? Because killing goes contrary to the right of life of all peoples. In fact, you know, everybody has the right to life. But then what happens when you are in a situation of danger, you know, or when one person is trying to harm you, or you're in a situation of war or combat, right? Or what about even more controversial topics like euthanasia or the death penalties, etc.? Now, these are just some simple examples I want to reference there And to simply make the point that the law can only go so far in trying to balance justice on the one hand and then mercy on the other. And then, of course, regulating the peoples, right? The communities. You have so many laws today, and the law in essence is there to help you, to help the society order and organize. Maybe another simple example, many of us are familiar with traffic laws, right? We've all been on the road. Now, imagine if there are no traffic laws. It would be very difficult, right? Because who has the right of way? Who can drive and on when and how, and who can't, right? And so that becomes problematic. And so the law then orders it in such a way, right? Or, the speed limit sign. There's a reason why. Because if you go too fast, you might, it becomes unsafe, right? Whether it's in a residential zone, even on the freeway, when you're going 100, that's not necessarily safe, right? So those are just points I want to reference there and share as we enter into the gospel reading for this 22nd Sunday in Ordinary Time. You see, as we read from the Gospel of St. Mark chapter 7, here's what it says. When the Pharisees with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. For the Pharisees, and in fact all the Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed, the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. Okay, now, we've heard of scribes and Pharisees before, right? If we read the gospel readings, we've all heard of them. Here's the point. They are not bad people. In fact, the scribes and Pharisees, they're pretty good people. They try to follow the law. The scribes are considered as scholars of the law. And the Pharisees, they hold themselves to pretty high standards. And they do try to follow the law. But the problem is they have such a narrow interpretation of the law that they fall into the issue of legalism. They fall into the issue of following the law rather than understanding why the law is there to begin with. And, oftentimes we hear about Jesus criticizing them as hypocrites because they, on the one hand, tell you what the law is and they say you have to follow it, but then on the other hand, they don't do that. Right? And so that's the problem. We all recall passages where the disciples of Jesus, for example, was walking through a field of grain on the Sabbath, right? And so what's the law? What's the divine law? Well, keep holy the Sabbath. Well, the disciples were walking through the field of grain on the Sabbath and they were hungry. And so they started picking the grain to eat, right? To satisfy their very hunger because they need to eat. Well, so what are they to do? Should they follow the Sabbath and not eat and starve, or should they eat? Well, of course, the answer is fairly clear, right? They have to eat because they are hungry. And so the passage there, as well as this passage and other passages we find in the gospel reading regarding the Pharisees, these passages lay out the issue, right, of the Pharisees, the narrow-minded thinking, the narrow interpretation of the law. You end up with legalism, so then comes the main issue. Continuing on the gospel reading, here comes the question from the Pharisees. Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands? Now, interesting question, right? Think about this again. Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands? In other words, they're saying, hey, look, their hands are unclean. They're not following tradition. Why? Why are they doing that? And, the response from Jesus is self-evident. Look, here's what Jesus says. Well, did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites as it is written? This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts. You disregard God's commandment, but cling to human tradition. I think this passage here from Isaiah summarizes everything that could be said about the issue, the main issue here in the gospel reading for today. In other words, so oftentimes human traditions are created and they're forced upon everyone to follow while forgetting the most important thing of all, listening to God's commandment of love. You see, everything has to begin with love. Because as you see here in this passage, the end, it's in the heart of the person. It's not just the law. It's not even just the intention. It's in the very heart of each person. And the key word here is love. It is through love that you can find the right balance between justice on the one hand and then mercy on the other. And these two always have to be aligned. They have to be balanced, right? It's the same thing that when you talk about love, you have the deeper understanding and appreciation for human law. Because if the law is created out of love, if you will, then of course it is just, and there are elements of mercy to it as well too. And so here's the final takeaway from all of this. Listen again to the prophet Isaiah. These people honors me with their lips, but in their heart they are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts. Okay, so in other words, don't just honor God with our lips, right? With our words, but also in our actions. What is in our heart, right? So you want to follow the law? Well, follow the one law of love, right? That's the key word. And the law of love is not just in words, but it's in action. How do you love your neighbor? How do you love God? By following his commandments. And so then consider this final question for reflection as we close out this gospel reading for this Sunday and the 22nd Sunday in Ordinary Time. How are you following God's commandment to love this day, right? So tradition aside, the various different tradition and practices and things like that, the one key thing is love. And we can find this across time, across culture, across societies. And so then again, the question is this: how are you following God's commandment to love this day? May God bless you.